Well, welcome to another of the Jack the Ripper suspect videos. And today we're going to talk about an intriguing suspect. In fact, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating of all the Jack the Ripper suspects. This is a man who, even if he wasn't a Jack the Ripper suspect, his life would be a Hollywood movie in its own right. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Tony McMahon, who's the author of the book Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln. And you really couldn't have a better combination when it comes to true crime history and true crime mystery. So, hello, Tony.
Hello. Good to join you. And yeah, no, it is an incredible combination that, to be honest with you, I didn't expect to find because I was originally asked to appear on a TV program, I won't say which one, to talk about Francis Tumblety, just solely in terms of Jack the Ripper. And then suddenly this unexpected link to Abraham Lincoln arose. But I'll explain all of that.
In historical works, two names you don't readily associate together are Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln. And yet this man, Dr. Francis Tumblety, ended up implicated in both cases, didn't he? So shall we start with Abraham Lincoln? How did he find himself implicated in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln?
I know it's absolutely incredible, and it's just simply beggars belief. But basically, Francis Tumblety, is an Irish American. We think he was born in Dublin. He may have been born in the States, may have been born in Canada, but we think it was Dublin. Emigrates, like a lot of my ancestors did on the Irish side of my family, to the US in the aftermath of the famine. And I think, like a lot of people in the United States in the mid-19th century, it's an age where you've got to get rich or you're going to die trying, basically, or you're going to spend your life, as somebody once put it, in the prison of hunger. And the way to do that, if you didn't come from a privileged background, is you invent your past or you invent a persona. And Tumblety invents this persona. He trains to be some kind of herb doctor. I suppose we'd call him a quack doctor, but there were loads of them at the time, and the line between accepted medicine and quack medicine was somewhat more blurred than it is now. So he trains to be a herb doctor. He sets himself up in practice, but very early on, he seems to learn from people like P.T. Barnum, a circus performer of the time, that the best way to drum up business is to have this kind of ridiculous, over-the-top persona. And you could say it's almost a kind of incipient celebrity culture that's beginning to arise in the mid-19th century, which is growing really at the same time as the mass media. For the first time, we're getting, a mass newspaper audience. And Tumblety just seems to instinctively plug into that. And so by the time of the Lincoln assassination, he's actually quite a well-known quack doctor. He fills the newspapers with paid classified advertising. He rides down Main Street in any city he sets up shop in this crazy cavalry uniform. And he has quite a kind of well-heeled clientele. And by all accounts, and certainly by the research I did, he genuinely made quite a bit of money, and people were prepared to part with their cash because they didn't have access to, or they didn't trust, or they hadn't been cured by mainstream medicine. So they went to Tumblety, who claimed his pills could cure everything from cancer to pimples. And so by the time of the assassination, he is a well-known figure. He claims to be a physician to Abraham Lincoln himself, that he even cured his nephew or son, I can't recall which now, of a sprained ankle. But Lincoln had his own medical problems, including syphilis, and I believe Tumblety also would contract syphilis later on. But that was very common for quack doctors to claim they had cures for that. And so by the time of the assassination, yes, Tumblety, he is in Washington, D.C., He's even seen riding behind Lincoln's coach at his inaugural parade in New York, to the horror of journalists who write about it, and it is all there in the record. And he somehow becomes implicated when Lincoln is assassinated, and is arrested and imprisoned over that. And as I show in the book, I think that there is very strong evidence to suggest that Tumblety, he knew John Wilkes Booth, the man who fired the gun. He employed one of the other conspirators, David Herold, and that is commented on in the newspapers at the time, how bizarre that was, and how Herold followed Tumblety like a whipped dog. And then there's a report that I found from 1914, an interview with a police captain who was retired by then, who said that he'd seen Tumblety and John Wilkes Booth together in Buffalo when Booth, who was an actor, was in the theatre playing a Shakespearean role. But also he believed that Tumblety introduced Booth to Mary Surratt, who is the woman who was hanged over the Lincoln assassination. So you can see that there were links, and why, at the direct orders of the Secretary of War, who Tumblety developed a very personal, vicious hatred towards, he was arrested and imprisoned at the Old Capitol Prison, accused of being involved in the gang that assassinated Lincoln. So Jack the Ripper's involved in assassinating Lincoln. I know it's a bit of a head model, that. He's also accused, by the way, of being involved in a plot to spread yellow fever among Union troops, among Lincoln's army during the Civil War. And he somehow gets off both charges.
Because one thing I've always wondered about him is, because like you say, I mean, he certainly knew how to self-publicize. I mean, this man's adverts are amazing. The Great American Herb Doctor. Who is the Great American Herb Doctor? Fantastic. So do you think he might have used the Abraham Lincoln assassination for self-publicity?
Well, this is the thing. He was accused of this at the time. People said, is Tumblety skirting too close to the edge? Because his way of operating was actually quite well recognized. I mean, there was even a rail company once that was chastised in the paper for using Tumblety-like marketing techniques. His modus operandi was not only recognized, it was lampooned. There was even a burlesque in the theatre about Tumblety's, relentless self-promotion. But I think to have got himself implicated in the Lincoln plot, to me, that's a step too far. I mean, remember, it's a capital crime. He was going to be put on trial. It also, I think, would have been hugely destructive to his business. I mean, I cannot see that being implicated in the Lincoln murder, unless he was going to get a load of old Confederate, bitter old Confederates to sign up as clients. But actually, that doesn't figure, because most of his operations were in the northern cities and actually in Canadian cities. So if you look where he operates, it's actually in the Irish diaspora cities on both sides of the Canadian-American border. So Montreal, Toronto, Detroit, New York, Chicago. Nobody was going to pat him on the back for being involved in killing Lincoln there. That's solid Union territory. So I don't buy it. And I think his reaction afterwards, where he is furious, I mean, he comes out with this autobiography where he feels the need to put his side of the argument, and he fires back in the newspapers, classified ads saying, this is outrageous and so on. And I do think it takes the wind out of his sails as well for a while. His exuberant PR tones down a bit. He enters a slightly darker phase after the Lincoln assassination. So I don't think it benefits him. I don't see that he orchestrated this connection. I genuinely think he was swept up in the post-assassination, round them all up, round up the usual suspects, and he just fitted the bill. I mean, his associations with David Herald in particular, just looked very suspicious.
I think I agree with you that there's better ways to get publicity than getting involved in the assassination of a president. I mean, he's the sort of person, isn't he, who today, I mean, he'd be on Big Brother, he'd be a reality TV star. You wouldn't get him off the TV. But he is just one of those colourful characters. And of course, he did have an awful habit of killing several patients as well, who he was supposedly curing.
Yes, I mean, to be honest, coming back to your point, what I found really interesting writing the book is that, we have celebrities in our own time who have a sinister side, and we've seen celebrities sent to prison, and all the various scandals in recent years. And he's undoubtedly somebody who he enjoys the limelight, but he very clearly has another side to his personality. I mean, not that, I'm an LGBT man myself, so I'm not going to criticize Tumblety for being a gay man. But his homosexuality was something he did not try to keep that a secret. He's very open about it, and he is tailed not only by the police but by the Pinkerton Detective Agency And this is at a time when the concept of homosexuality is starting to emerge, through the new science of psychology, psychiatry. And there are writings about Tumblety later on, when he's implicated in the Ripper case, where the association between being a psychopath and a homosexual is, which we wouldn't make that association now, but that association is made in relation to Tumblety. But no, he is a celebrity with, by the standards of the time, he has this very questionable personal life. He's always hiring guys that he picks up on the streets who then rob him. He goes to the police. They then say that he assaulted them. It all ends up in court, but he's always rescued by his networks over and over again. But as you say, it gets more sinister still, because he's implicated very early on in a manslaughter in St. John, New Brunswick in Canada, one of his patients, James Portmore, where astonishingly he tries to rob the guy's organs, the evidence basically, out of the mortuary. And then he basically rides off across the border into the US and gets away with it. He's not chased across the US. The newspapers report it almost comically, that this guy has killed one of his patients. He's up on a manslaughter charge, but off he rides, and somehow it's just laughed off. And in fact, he goes back to Canada later on with no consequences. But then, 20 years later, he's then implicated again in a manslaughter case of one of his patients in Liverpool, not that long before the Ripper case. And that case, he's severely reprimanded in court, but he basically, and this is him over and over again, he gets off the manslaughter charge, but it's by the skin of his damn teeth.
This was the Edward Hanratty case.
The Hanratty case. And I think it's fair to assume, I cannot believe that there weren't other incidents in between. I'm not necessarily saying that he was intentionally killing his patients, though if we believe that he was Jack the Ripper, that's something that certainly has to be considered. But it certainly looks very suspicious that he's had up for manslaughter of two of his patients and violent assault of his patients as well, and other people as well. These outbreaks of violence.
It's what's one thing that's really fascinating about him is I was in the Isle of Man, and I can't remember which library it is, but one of the libraries have got his letters and to Hall Caine, the Hall Caine collection, and they've got his letters. And they were fascinating to read, because I don't think he wrote a lot of them, because as you say, he did have a habit of he employed a lot of young men as his secretary, and he'd been in various hotels with them. They'd be writing letters on his behalf. But one thing that struck me about a few of the letters is they bore quite a nice similarity. And I know this probably wasn't written by the murderer, but they have a similarity to the Dear Boss Jack the Ripper letter in the style of handwriting.
Absolutely. And I mean, the Hall Caine relationship is, obviously, Hall Caine was an up-and-coming author, seems to have had major anxiety issues and a bit of an inferiority complex earlier on in his life, and Tumblety takes him under his wing, and the two of them are in a relationship during his Liverpool phase. I should say that Tumblety, in the years after the Lincoln assassination, is bouncing between the United States and England and Europe. I mean, he seems to be on steamers half the time, considering the amount of time it must have taken him to make those voyages. But he has this association with Hall Caine, who also is great friends with Bram Stoker, as you know, the Dracula author. And I think I'm right in saying he eventually ends up in a relationship with Gabriele Rossetti, with the painter, the artist, and he and Tumblety have quite an acrimonious bust-up, but it's as Hall Caine is, steadily emerging as a very successful author, while Tumblety is going into something of a dark decline. But the letters are interesting, and they show Tumblety as a very possessive, manipulative person. He's constantly haranguing Hall Caine to come and see him, haranguing him over minor debts, trying to use any leverage over him to basically to draw him back into his orbit. He's a very narcissistic person, Tumblety, and I think we see that in the Hall Caine correspondence. And I do think there is an interesting tonality between that and and a couple of the Ripper letters.
And of course, the other thing about it, where you mentioned there that he's moving between America and Liverpool, and do you think he had Fenian connections? Do you think there was any Fenian connection? Because, of course, this is the time when you're having the Fenian bombing campaigns in London.
So it's interesting. I say, as somebody's half Irish and LGBT, the thing that I started to get very interested, actually quite a bit later on, when I moved from looking at the sources, as it were, putting that information down, you then start to kind of theorize, basically, based on, your research. And I just started to think, why is it when he's in court, there's on one occasion, the mayor of Cincinnati comes forward to get him out of legal trouble. Another case where the New York district attorney comes forward to get him out of a pretty unpleasant legal case that the DA really didn't, for any reason, didn't need to get involved in. And I started to think, what Tumblety had here are networks. And he definitely uses his Irish networks in the US, as I think, by the way, plenty of, if you were an Irish person climbing your way up through society, why wouldn't you? He actually nearly runs as an Irish candidate for the Irish Party in Canada before the manslaughter charge. He nearly ran for the Canadian Parliament on the Irish ticket, and he definitely does hang out with Fenians. I mean, basically people on the Fenian ticket, and also in New York. I believe that he was using Irish networks through the Tammany Hall, Democrat network as well. He makes donations to causes and so on. I found one donation, interestingly, to the Jewish Garment Workers Union. Tiny reference in a newspaper. I went, my God, it's him. And so he's even trying to get the Jewish garment workers to come and rescue him if they ever needed them. But yeah, I undoubtedly, like a lot of Irish people, in the diaspora, he's going to be bitter. He's going to have that kind of romantic view of the homeland. I had relatives of my own. My great uncle was in New Jersey. Was a school superintendent who hated the British so much. By the way, he went to fight with the Boers in the Boer War, as many Irish Americans did. That's an untold story. I think somebody needs to tell that story. A lot of Irish Americans went to fight with the Boers in the Boer War. So Tumblety is undoubtedly part of that Irish diaspora. He's got the diaspora politics. He's operating in those political circles. And I do think that those networks, those Irish networks, plus I'm pretty sure, thinking about it, gentlemen of the same persuasion in terms of sexuality, I'm sure were looking out for each other as well. So I think he had various networks on the go to protect him, because he's never sent to jail and he gets off some pretty big damn charges,
Well, of course, he does appear to get off the biggest one of them all, because of all the suspects, he's the only one who we know for certain was arrested at the time in connection with the Whitechapel murders. And we know it because, A, he goes back to America and boasts about it. He's doing endless newspaper reportings about it. He's even under surveillance from Inspector Byrne at the NYPD. But then later on, completely unrelated, Inspector Littlechild, who was in charge of Special Branch at the time, answers a letter from George Sims, the journalist, asking him, was there ever a Dr. D? And he said, no, but there was a Dr. T. And then we get this idea that the police actually, well, at the time, had arrested Tumblety in connection with the Whitechapel murders.
Well, as you say, it's all in plain sight. And do you know what I found when I got to that part, where he skips bail? So he's arrested, he pays a large bail payment. Then he basically skips bail, as you know. He goes off to on a steamer to France and then off to New York, where he's met by journalists. He's also tailed by detectives from England who still suspect him. And as you say, he launches a series of attacks on Scotland Yard over their handling of the case. He's really, I think to a degree, he had no choice but to be open about it, because there was actually a lot of commentary in the American press. And the overwhelming majority of that commentary in the American press was negative. I mean, people came forward from his past, and I would say 90% of them said he is Jack the Ripper. And these included childhood friends and so on. So I think he had to come back to settle some scores and as he saw it, to put the record straight. But what I think is really interesting, I combed through all the newspapers reports in that part in the early 1890s, and you have him coming back. You have him, as you say, attacking Scotland Yard. But then people start saying, well, he's got this strange valet, hasn't he? He's got this very odd valet who they call Jack the Texan, who it seems has been his valet for up to 20 years, possibly. There are reports of him being seen with this guy 20 years earlier. And journalists even speculate, could he have helped Tumblety to carry out the killings in Whitechapel? And then a couple of journalists even speculate, could Jack the Texan have been involved in a notorious string of killings called the Servant Girl Annihilator murders in Texas? Now, this may all be wild speculation, but these are the conversations that are being had very openly in the press. And then, as you know, there's a copycat Ripper murder in New York shortly after Tumblety gets back. Carrie Brown, a prostitute in a hotel. And Byrne, the head of the NYPD, says, it's definitely the Ripper. The Ripper is here. But strangely doesn't drag in the man who's been arrested in London as a Ripper suspect. He goes after a guy instead, an Algerian called Ben Ali, who eventually is pardoned after he's gone mad in prison and clearly hadn't committed the murder. And Tumblety at the same time is had up on a charge of violent assault on a rent boy, basically, in the middle of the night. And that's when the district attorney of New York gets him off the case. It's all very, very odd. The whole thing is odd. And we know, of course, that the reason that Tumblety was set aside as a suspect was, of course, there were other murders after Mary Kelly, but that we now don't regard as canonical, but were then, regarded as possibly Jack the Ripper. And I think that took the heat off Tumblety to a degree. And then you talk about the Littlechild letter there. I think the Littlechild letter is really interesting, not just because of what it says, but reading between, the lines. I mean, Littlechild, as you know, was involved in the Oscar Wilde case in terms of collecting evidence for that. And a lot of his references in that letter are clearly placing Tumblety and Oscar Wilde in the kind of, what do they call it, psychosexualis. But it's that kind of terrible psychology that gay people were, basically mad and needed to be cured. And so, Littlechild is saying, well, no wonder Tumblety's a serial killer. He's a homosexual, isn't he? And he fits into that naughty homosexual bucket that, Oscar Wilde does. But also there's a reference to the Harry Thor case when they talk about, isn't there a reference to Thor leaving some coins on a table in a hotel and then watching the bellboy take it, and then he comes in and surprises the bellboy and punishes him in a horrible way, etc. But what I think is interesting about the Harry Thor case, which I think Littlechild and Sims would have known about, is that, of course, he's also implicated in murdering Stanford White, the architect in New York, later on. I mean, the crime of the century, it was called at the time. And he was protected by something called the Sewer Club, a kind of an underground club, gentleman's club. And I did wonder whether or not Littlechild is kind of referencing that whole world of gentlemen looking after themselves. Not just that Tumblety is homosexual, but Tumblety is part of this underground, seedy, sordid network of, elite gay men who are basically looking out for themselves. And I kind of people could disagree with me, but I kind of detected that was what lies behind, to a degree, behind the Harry Thor reference in that letter. So no, that letter, obviously uncovered in the 90s. I'm not claiming credit for uncovering that. Very interesting letter, and I think it still bears further analysis in relation to Tumblety. And as you say, they clearly thought, in retrospect, decades later, yeah, you know what, it was him, wasn't it?
What I find about the letter is it is a very homophobic letter.
Oh yeah,
there's a lot in there that you think, oh, hang on, because he's basically saying his sexuality is the reason why he's carried out the murders. He's on there, and like you say, because Littlechild was employed by taken on by the Marquess of Queensberry to gather the evidence on Oscar Wilde as well. So I think you've got that degree in the Littlechild letter. But one thing that I wanted to ask you, because this often gets said in the comment section whenever I mention Tumblety or I do a video about Tumblety, I always get the comment, well, that kind of in Tumblety, he was gay, and gay men only murder other gay men. Is there evidence for this?
Well, we know that isn't true. And to be honest with you, I think that Tumblety's sexuality, weirdly, people have found it uncomfortable to deal with it. And I'll be honest with you, in conversations that I've had even now, I've sort of done blog tours and so on, and you do find some bloggers are like, oh, do we have to talk about that? But the thing is that it's central to his character, and I think that look at the elements you've got. He is, and I've talked about this to other gay men who just say, well, it must have been a time of being incredibly repressed, it's a time that level of repression and hatred and being ostracized was going to impact anybody. And I'm not saying that is what made him a serial killer, but if he was already had psychopathic tendencies, it wasn't going to help, basically, that kind of anger building up. I think he had anger building up over the way he was treated. He wanted to be treated as a respectable figure, and he was constantly being degraded in the papers over his sexuality. He wanted justice against these thieving valets that he employed, and it always, over and over again, it's the same bloody cycle he goes through with his valets, and they go to court and they accuse him of sexual harassment, and he has to run or drop it or whatever. He's also, of course, degraded over the fact he's not a real doctor. And I do think that there is some of his later writings, he gets very obsessive about, they think a real doctor has to cut people open and I'm just a herb doctor. And I do wonder whether the modus operandi of Jack the Ripper, the ritualistic element, is a frustrated surgeon at work, and we see that obviously in the murder of Stride, where he's interrupted and then he has to go and do it again because he hasn't gone through that kind of OCD, ritual of being a doctor. But in terms of being a gay man who can murder women, that I think is completely discredited. Gay men can murder anybody if they put their minds to it. And we know that he's got a problem with prostitutes because he tells this story that he was married to a woman who he then found out was a prostitute, and that this is his own words, by the way, that he swore off women forever. He talks about it in his autobiography, and it's quoted by two other sources in newspaper interviews later on. So he, out of his own mouth, he says, I don't like prostitutes. And then, of course, the most damning thing of all, and this is Scotland Yard, by the way, as you know, originally they arrest him for gross indecency with 4 men. It's when they confer with police in the United States by telegraph, who then say, oh, Tumblety, don't you know him? And they don't, of course, because he's not a celebrity in Britain. And they not only go through his misogyny, which is so well known, he's so violently verbal against women, it's well recognized. It's this bizarre fact that he has a collection of women's uteruses in glass jars, which he shows at dinner parties. And, he takes people in after dinner, all male dinner parties. In fact, it's even remarked that one man once said, why are there no women here? And he flew off the handle and said, they're cows, they're cattle, used terms like this. And then he takes the men into a room, opens this cabinet of curiosity, and shows off these uteruses in glass jars, which one witness just says, this is the most disturbing, bizarre thing I've seen. Well, of course, for Scotland Yard, they think misogyny, Annie Chapman, uterus gone. This is, and they don't need to hear anymore. The violence, his violent record, he's a dodgy character, bang. Whether or not he's the Ripper, we can argue about, but whether or not he was capable of being the Ripper, being a gay man is irrelevant. I can assure you, gay men are equal opportunity slayers. They'll kill anybody.
That was one of the most interesting things I found was, because I've been to dinner parties, and conversation dwindles a bit at the end. You and then it's just what everybody needs is to view a collection of uteri in glass jars. Do we know where he got them from?
Well, this is one of the interesting things, because there's another account of him displaying them when he fraudulently gets a job as a surgeon in the Union Army during the Civil War. He's kicked out by General McClellan in person, who accuses him of distributing pornography, but it's probably information on venereal diseases. But he has this collection of uteruses for a long time. I mean, whether he replenishes this collection, one doesn't wish to imagine. But where does he get them from? I mean, the only legal source you could think of, and is that even legal, would be mortuaries. Other than that, one has to entertain the prospect that there were murders before the Ripper murders, that he was removing these uteruses from women. And that's certainly what Scotland Yard must have suspected. This guy's signature approach to slaying women is to eviscerate them and to remove their organs. Here is a man who shows uteruses in glass jars to his dinner party guests, as you say, as cigars, port, and uteruses. I mean, really? So that immediately has Scott, and why shouldn't it? I mean, it's absolutely bizarre. And, so often serial killers, as we know, they do dare to be caught. They do they do give clues, as it were. They dare the authorities to find them. And I do wonder whether this is, Tumblety's way of daring the authorities to realise that he is a serial killer.
And of course, when he dies, there's quite an intriguing find amongst his possessions when he dies as well, isn't there?
Well, this is So he dies. He checks into a hospital in St. Louis using the pseudonym that he used to escape from London when he escaped the Jack the Ripper charges. He uses that pseudonym again. And Tumblety, every time he's arrested, by the way, and he's arrested God knows how many times during his life, and he talks about this in his autobiography, it's reported in the papers, he's always found with ridiculous amounts of money and diamonds on his person. And in fact, he accuses the police basically of shaking him down for their own benefit. They're taking a cut when they arrest him. They know that they're going to get a payday when they arrest him. When he's in the hospital in St. Louis, he basically goes in as a dying man, and he dies. He has a fall in the hospital, dies. And they basically, obviously, then remove his clothes, etc., preparing him for burial. They find the customary cash, diamonds. There's a heap of money in the bank, which his family fights over. But then there's these two dirt cheap rings on his person, two brass rings they're described as. And one of the features of the Annie Chapman murder case, Jack the Ripper case, was the absence of her wedding ring, and I think it's what they call a keeper ring, the other ring that keeps the wedding ring on. Two cheap rings, value $2-3, pounds, whatever. And in fact, there's even a scouring of the pawnbrokers of London looking for these rings. Scotland Yard goes looking for these rings. It's seen as a key clue. And it has excited a lot of people, a lot of ripperologists in particular, that Tumblety, who has very good taste, immaculate taste, loves his expensive jewelry, and he's got these two dirt cheap rings. Why? Well, we know that he keeps uteruses, arguably, possibly as mementos. Does he keep Annie Chapman's two rings on his person as a barbaric memento of that murder back in 1888?
And this is all in the book. This is all in Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln.
It is indeed. Yeah. I mean, I say I have never written something like this where literally going decade by decade through all the newspapers, had a great fun time in the British Library as well, going through police records, court records, and so on. It was like skeletons falling out of the closet constantly. I didn't have to speculate. I simply had to set the damn facts down and what journalists and police and private detectives said at the time. And the story is just compelling in itself. I think, as you say, he's an interesting character because he is a proto-celebrity. He speaks to our time because he is this kind of proto-celebrity. On top of that, his sexuality is just something that I think has embarrassed some people, but I've just tackled head on, and also looked in terms of the sexualities of Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, which have also been discussed. Hugely contentious, I know, but they have been discussed, so I discuss them again. And then in relation to Tumblety, could that have had anything to do with his relationships with those people? But there's so many layers to Tumblety, but just telling his story as, in his own words, which thankfully he did write his own autobiography as well, is just a story that takes us through that Civil War era, the Gilded Age, which everybody loves that era, of the back streets of Victorian London again. We never get enough of that. And I think it's fascinating just to look at that era through his eyes, through the eyes of a very, very disturbed, strange man. I don't know if we have empathy for him at the end of it, but I certainly think you can't take your eyes off him. Let's put it like that.
Well, we didn't mention that, not being able to take your eyes off him, because there's another comment that's often made in the comment section whenever I discuss Tumblety is, well, he would have stuck out like a sore thumb. You just have to look at his moustache. You just have to look at his dress style. But of course, one of the things he does say to an American journalist when he's back in America is the reason he was arrested was because he went down slumming into Whitechapel to see the scenes of the murders. So he wouldn't have looked like that image we have him with that massive overextended moustache. That's not what he would have looked like. He would have been sort of blending into the area. But as he says, he went to Whitechapel to look at the murder sites. Well, that's his claim anyway. So, do you think he would have looked how we think he looks, or do you think he would have been completely different?
I must admit, I know he says that there are certainly accounts that he begins to look more rough, more down at heel. And I found one piece of evidence that he may even spent time in a workhouse in the US, in between his period in as the Ripper charges and the Lincoln assassination. I think his fortunes go up and down, basically. I think as well, and I do examine this, and I think it's been overlooked, is that I believe he was syphilitic, and that's why he was going to Hot Springs, Arkansas, because one of the things I think that's been overlooked about Hot Springs is that was known, 90% known as a resort for syphilis. And, syphilis was a very common disorder in big cities. It's estimated that 15-20% of Londoners may have been syphilitic, in the mid-late 19th century. So it's not that unusual, and especially if you're as promiscuous as Tumblety. And that syphilis would have been taking a toll on him physically, mentally, his appearance. And I know that is used as an argument against him being the Ripper, but then, of course, we might bring in Jack the Texan there, but I still think he had sufficient strength, I'm sure, to commit the murders. But I think he says that his appearance was more understated. I find it hard to believe that Tumblety was ever that understated. I'm sure that he was being tailed by detectives when he was in Whitechapel. I bet he stuck out like a sore thumb. I bet his moustache was still, mine on point. So I'm slightly skeptical. I think he may not have looked as grand as he did in the 1850s, 1860s, but I bet he really was pretty identifiable. But the idea that, being a serial killer means that, you don't seek the limelight. Well, I think we know in our own time that there are celebrities capable of absolutely abhorrent crimes who had the most massively high profile. And in fact, if anything, it shields some celebrities. Celebrities use the limelight. So, well, of course it can't be me because I'm a public figure. I wouldn't do that kind of thing. And I think that combination of being a psychopath but also a narcissist, he wants everything. He wants to be a public figure. He wants to be rich, but he also wants to hurt people. That does seem to be, unfortunately, and it is proven in the courts and in the police records. There's manslaughter, there's violence, and he's arrested for murder. It's all there.
And of course, with celebrities as well, when there are suggestions, and I won't name any names, but when there are suggestions of them being up to no good, there's always their fans are always saying, "Oh no, it couldn't have been him." And of course, this happens with Tumblety as well. His landlady in New York comes, "No, he's such a gentleman. He's such a nice man." And again, you get this refusal to believe that they could do anything wrong, because we today certainly probably are obsessed with this idea of celebrity, and they're almost up on a pedestal.
Well, I mean, you think of a certain I won't name his name, so I don't want to, but a certain notorious, proven paedophile disc jockey from the 1970s, who had a high-profile TV show with lots of children on it, but he was still abusing children, and in fact was his means of attracting children, young people to him. And I think Tumblety, the fact he's a celebrity, but that's how he gets the contact that he wants. I think he has various appetites. One is undoubtedly a huge appetite for self-publicity. He definitely likes money. There's no doubt about that, but he spends it like crazy as well. But the evidence for his violence is just there. That is part of his makeup. And I certainly think, and this is something I try to explore later in the book, that I think his mental state does deteriorate, later on. I think syphilis is a good explanation. It's a logical explanation. It follows with his, increasing trips to Hot Springs, which have a kind of an air of desperation about them. And there's an interesting story that when he is in Hot Springs, he goes into a department store after the Ripper killings, and the female employees in the department store all run away to the other wall because they go, "Oh my God, it's him, the Ripper." He has that effect on people for years afterwards. People are absolutely terrified of him, and he's recognized across the states as the Ripper who got away. And clearly some people think he was still up to no good.
And this is coming back to the book, because I have to say that the cover of the book, and I'm going to put him on the screen here. It's absolutely, the cover's fantastic. It really has got that atmosphere about it. The illustrations and the cover, were they commissioned especially for the book?
So the cover. I mean, I'm a huge fan of using AI for these things because I like to command a robot to give me what I want. So that was basically partly obviously the publisher's designer, but the core of it came out of AI. I actually have created a massive images of Tumblety that I've played around with a big walrus moustache and him at night, and I haven't used them for anything yet, but I must do. I must make a few videos and use those, but I think that's one of the beauties of AI is that it kind of helps you to visualize how you're seeing him. And it's interesting how a robot, the AI robot imagines him as well. But that is a creation. I think he's a bit too slim on the cover of the book, I have to say. I can imagine by that stage bulkier, but we don't know.
Well, I'll let viewers judge for themselves. I'll put it up on the screen, so it'll be on the screen there. And where can people? Last of all, where can people get the book?
Well, the book is available. Of course, it's on Amazon, which is obviously to the horror of bookstores everywhere. But yes, it is on Amazon. It's on Waterstones. It's on all the major. I believe it's on Barnes and Noble and all the major kind of online book sites. So if you put Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln by Tony McMahon in, it'll come up on a number of sites. I think I've even seen them being sold on eBay now. But so there you go. People have bought them and then trying to flog them. And then there'll be bookstores, independent bookstores, if you check in, and they'll be stocking it. But I'm afraid Amazon is probably the most obvious place to go. And
okay, I'll put a link to Amazon down in the section below. And you also have your TV channel as well, don't you?
Yes, I have a YouTube channel. I'm happy to send you a link to that as well. I mean, I appear on a lot of. For the last 8 years, I've been appearing on TV documentaries. History Channel, Discovery, Science, and so on. My original speciality is the Knights Templar, but I comment on everything now, from Nazis to UFOs. I think I just have a face that fits for TV. So I've just done, actually, this week, I've done William Shatner's The Unexplained this week, which appears on History, which is actually the show. I did an episode for that show on Francis Tumblety. And that's what started the whole interest in Tumblety. So, but they didn't explore the Abraham Lincoln side of it. They just did the Ripper case and the fact he's the only person to have been definitively arrested, and of course the main American suspect. So I think to kind of put all this in front of people, as you know, just makes this a hugely interesting story. And for me, I've got to say, just as a final thought, is that I find him way more interesting than the royal family, the Freemasons, and all those kind of other angles, because I don't know. I just think he's a more credible suspect, but he's also so much a person of his age, and that rags to riches story is something that we can all kind of identify with now. And the fact that he is an influencer with a dark side, well, we know quite a few of those. So there you are.
Do you think he'd have his own? He'd have a YouTube channel today. His Instagram. What would he do on his channel? Would it be like health tips? The Tumblety diet.
Exactly. He'd be a TV doctor. He'd be all over TikTok and YouTube with dubious advice, but he'd also be firing salvos against his enemies. Because remember, one of the things that he did is he attacked mainstream physicians by name in his classified ads. So you can imagine he'd probably be having his account suspended all the time for his personal attacks and so on. But no, I think he would have fitted in like a glove.
Didn't he get sued for libel once as well because he used someone's name in an advert, and he said that they'd got pimples or something, and they and they sued him for libel because he'd said what it was wrong with them.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Sorry, I nearly put yes, because I know he sued as well for libel in the other direction. But yes, he was sued for libel. I think I'm right in saying the person concerned stepped back down. Yes, it was wasn't it Liverpool? I think somebody, and the case never went to court. Now, what I suspect is, as usual, Tumblety paid them off. I mean, I can't believe that. I'm sure they came to an amicable settlement on the court steps. But absolutely, and Tumblety in turn sued a theatre for doing a burlesque, for doing a spoof about him. And I believe another person thumped him in the street for actually featuring him in one of his ads without permission. So I think he was always constantly in trouble for either appearing in other people's stuff, or getting, not seeking permission from the people that he named. I remember that, as you know, he had commendations from Charles Dickens, Emperor Louis Napoleon of France. He had a letter from him, alleged, saying that Tumblety's cures were amazing. And even, most cheeky of all, he had a letter from the dead Abraham Lincoln endorsing his cures for years.
And I mean, everything else aside, even if he's not Jack the Ripper, he's. I mean, you've got a whole movie there in his whole life. I mean, that's a fantastic. Well, it's a series on Netflix, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I think it is, and I think it's kind of. It speaks to our time so much, that I think people would find it, and it's that ideal mix of kind of murder, and obviously his personality and diversity and, celebrity and so on and so forth. So no, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, I'll try and get that. I need to be rich. I'll go to Netflix and see if they'll get the series of the book. You get a cut as well.
That's it. We'll both do. We'll joint write it. We'll be in there. Well, Tony, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking with you. It's this is a person. This is one of the suspects I could talk about for hours. But it's been fascinating talking. And of course, you're at work on the Knights Templar now as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I've got a trilogy, a trio of books with Pen and Sword, or the publisher, and the first one out in November. Next one out the middle of next year, next one out after that. But yes, Knights Templar, History and Mystery. There we are. So something very different. So I've moved from Victorian London to the Middle Ages in my mind at the moment. So, but it was nice to come back to Victorian London and Victorian America, for that matter.
Well, Tony McMahon, it's been wonderful talking to you. The book again is Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln, and I'll put a link to it in the description below. But thank you very much, and have a great remainder of your day.
Same to you. Have a great day.